talk a little bit about some research that we've done recently on social data, where it is in the enterprise, and kind of how it's being proliferated. And there's some really interesting stuff that we've been able to find by talking to brands and also talking to agencies and some of the technology vendors out there. So I'm going to give you just kind of a quick run through about where we are in the social analytics world. Then I'm going to talk about making social data actionable. See, Kurt, I said actionable, and so I've now paid my debt to you in terms of saying actionable. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about building a data-driven organization, because that's clearly something that all of us are struggling with, whether we're on the brand side, whether we're analysts, whether we're agencies, or what have you, and a maturity model that we came up with based on the kinds of things that folks like you are doing, and actually some of you in the audience have actually contributed to this research. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's next. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is that social media has proliferated so far into the organization now that you can't really think about it as an island anymore. And a couple of years ago, we heard a lot about social media command centers and social media centers of excellence and building social media competence and capability and all of this kind of stuff. But there wasn't really a lot of talk about social media as it relates to the rest of the business quite so much. It was really, how do we get smart about social? What does social mean? Who knows about social? So I want to really just start by saying, social's not an island. And here's the proof behind that. We've seen 13 different departments now that are actively involved in social media throughout enterprise class organizations. This is companies with more than 1,000 employees. And that is not just marketing, it's not just digital, it's HR, it's market research, it's field sales, it's IT, it's legal and compliance, it's everybody. And by actively involved, what we mean is that they are listening to and engaging with individuals outside the organization on social channels on behalf of their company. So 13 different departments. Hold that thought, because those are your stakeholders. And that makes things very, very complex. The next thing is that we're seeing that organizations kind of want context now about social data. And Seth did a fantastic job of talking about that with regard to market research. We're seeing not just market research, we're seeing customer relationship management, business intelligence, and other kind of enterprise data sets now starting to be viewed in the context of social data and vice versa. And I want to be clear about two things. Number one is this is a tiny sample size, because when we went out and interviewed companies and asked them the question, are you actively integrating, and by integrating I mean it in a very general sense, not technically integrating with a data warehouse, but looking at social data in conjunction with other enterprise data, many of them said no. But the ones who said yes were quite interesting, because they were starting to do what Seth is talking about in market research with customer relationship management, with business intelligence signals, with other even sensor data signals, to start to pull together more of a 360-degree view of the customer and what's happening with the customer. So the two caveats are small sample size and also the fact that of the sample size, the number of people who are doing it are small, and they're in many cases they're just printing out two reports and looking at them side by side, but they're trying to get a sense of, is social moving the needle in the rest of the business? Not just in terms of campaigns, but in terms of our kind of efforts to involve ourselves in social. So that's important. I want to talk a little bit about ecosystem, because one of the things I've seen a lot of in the last year is that as there are new and different use cases for social that extend beyond marketing into other areas, we're also seeing the fact that social data is filtering through the organization in all sorts of crazy ways. So if you look at this, if you think about publishers, I have three categories here. One is social networks, so that's Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Tumblr, everybody else. Community, so community platforms like Lithium and Jive. And then, of course, other communities out there also generating tons of social data. And that's structured and unstructured data. So unstructured data like comments and that sort of free-form stuff. And structured things like star ratings, votes up, votes down, those sorts of things, and sharing behavior. And then enterprise collaboration, which would be like Yammer and Chatter and Jive to some degree and that kind of thing. So you have the internal social data being collected on behalf of the enterprise, and then you have the community stuff that may or may not be affiliated with brand, and then you have the social data platforms. The social networks. And then the next layer is starting to pop up, and you're going to hear more about this with Twitter's IPO. This kind of whole conversation is getting a little bit more accelerated. These are the companies like GNIP and DataSift and Topsy Labs, and in Japan, NTT, who are actually reselling social data to either directly to brands or to companies like Sysomos and to other social application providers. And they're reselling that data and in some cases adding some value-added services to them. So things like spam filtration and sentiment analysis and things like that. And that's interesting because when you start thinking about it, with that capability, you can start to now add social data into lots of other places in the organization. Then we move into the social applications. Sorry, this is so small, but it says listening and monitoring. So that's some of what we've been talking about. Obviously, these are all starting to blend together a little bit. Next, engagement. So that's social media management systems like Spreadfast and Sprinkler and Hootsuite and all that stuff. Then publishing. That would be campaigns, OfferPop, Wildfire, Google, Buddy Media, Salesforce, all that kind of stuff. And then analytics, which actually should be below all three of those, but I couldn't make that work on the slide. And then on the other side, we have enterprise applications. So we have CRM, business intelligence, market research, email marketing. You saw Salesforce acquire ExactTarget. Again, trying to integrate those touch points very much along the lines of Zach's talk earlier. Fraud detection, big deal. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And then also sensor data. So if you think about companies, cough, cough, in the room who create devices that capture information about an individual's, for example, fitness level. You might want to understand something about those data points, and you might want to understand that in context of other signals about that customer. And so all of those things are kind of coming together into this beginnings of an ecosystem, really, around how do we use social data in the enterprise, how do we use it to understand the customer better, to deliver better programs, and to kind of get more of a holistic view, again, kind of speaking to what Zach was talking about. So I want to talk about influence kind of briefly, mostly because it's a hobby horse for me, but also because we're here, and a lot of the reason that we're here is to talk about influence. And I kind of think about it in two ways. One of them is, and forgive the 2x2, it was the easiest way to explain this. But one is potential influence versus actual influence. So when you think about influencers and an influencer program, and you go through the process that we've discussed already today about trying to find the people who are most relevant, who have the most contextual relationship to the kinds of goods and services that you sell, that's one thing, right? And you've developed this program, and you've empowered them, and you've created some sort of way to have an exchange of value, and you're hoping that they're going to share your message. Then there's the question of actual influence. So did anybody actually purchase your goods or services based on the recommendation of one of those people? Did somebody go to that travel blog and actually stay at a Radisson after they got their free ticket, or just because they saw that there was this contest? And did that propagate over time? And in fact, did they share with their network? So one of the things that we're hearing about, and we're seeing this built into some of the, what you would consider to be more, I guess, social suites or even web analytics types of providers like Adobe and Google Analytics, is this idea of a social total customer value. So the idea that I personally might not buy a Tesla S as much as I might personally want to buy a Tesla S, but I'm, sorry, I admit it, because I want to be cool, apparently. But I might talk about that. I might have influence in my network of friends. I might say something that has a clickable link. Some of my friends might click on that, might then get a referral to dealer. And I've maybe helped to influence a sale to some degree. And there is a propensity model somewhere, or an algorithm somewhere, that's going to explain that I have 0.003% let's say, responsibility for that sale. And even though my customer value as an individual is 0, my customer value as a social entity could be $3,000. And maybe over time I accumulate something such that at some point in the future, if I want to buy a Tesla S, I come into a dealer, they say, oh, you're Susan Etlenger, you're a deadbeat and you've never bought from us, but we see that you helped influence the sale of 3 cars for us, and so we're going to give you a discount. Now, will Tesla do this? You can ask Elon Musk, I have no idea, but we do know that that technology does exist today, and the capability to figure out the actual influence in addition to that potential thing and have that be more of a feedback loop is very much exists and is also on the way. Then there's kind of this thing between unknown and known. And if you ever remember what Donald Rumsfeld used to say, not that I quote him regularly, but I do on this particular point, he used to talk about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So the known unknowns are, since there are a bunch of, we're all a bunch of brand people in the room, you're going to have a crisis. Some of you in this room, within the next 6 months, are going to have a significant crisis. You might have an executive behave badly. And I like to think about these in categories, like executives or employees behaving badly. So we've seen this with fast food companies. We've seen this all sorts of things. There might be something that happens in terms of a product crisis like the Salmonella Foster Farms outbreak. There might be a legal issue. There might be a natural disaster, such as the Fukushima earthquake that affected the car industry so badly. Was it their fault the earthquake happened? Of course not. But they were affected nonetheless. Known unknowns. Then there are the unknown unknowns. The unknown unknowns are also, since it's late in the day and I'm going to be a little cheeky, let's just call it the WTF or who knew category. So one example of that is the 2012 presidential election. During the debate, Mitt Romney utters the phrase, "binders full of women." And if you went to the Amazon page for Avery Binders the next day, I swear to God, you would find, and I probably refreshed the page, I want to say like 20 times, review after review after review after review of Avery Binders, saying things like, "These binders are horrible, 1-star rating. Worst binders I've ever bought. None of my women fit into them." Okay, now, or the situation with Wendy, whose last name is escaping me, on the floor of the Texas, right, doing the filibuster and the pink shoes, right? The shoe company didn't want to do it. Could they have ever imagined that their shoes would gain national prominence because she was wearing them for a filibuster? Could Avery Binders have ever imagined that all of a sudden they would be in the news because of the comment that a presidential candidate made? Now, on the one hand, in both cases, because they both have political kind of relationships or overtones, both companies could choose not to pay attention and not to engage in any kind of debate about it. But it did mess up their retargeting and their search rankings, because when I went to look at a news story actually about the debate, I was actually retargeted for Avery Binders. Because it actually had the comment about binders full of women in it. And so it's showing me an ad for Avery Binders. That could have been really embarrassing, if you think about the ways in which some of these models work. So being able to understand that data in context is super important. So those are my 2 words about influence. Oh, actually, let me go back for a second, because I want to talk about this category I'm calling wildcard, and that's really the unknown unknowns, right? It's the unknown unknowns, but it's also the people you would never expect to be influential in a particular situation. And you think about, one good example of that is that when Osama bin Laden was killed, there was a gentleman by the name of Keith Urban, not the husband of Nicole Kidman, but a different Keith Urban, who used to work, again, with Rumsfeld. He's like my theme today for some reason. Again, with Donald Rumsfeld, he worked for him. And he has, at the time, he had about 1,000 Twitter followers, which is respectable, but by no means like somebody that you would say, oh my God, this person is a serious influencer in politics. Very well-respected guy. And he tweeted that he had heard a pretty convincing or pretty well-sourced report that Osama bin Laden had been killed. This was before any of the news broke. And so, if you were to go look for him and say, who's going to be influential in this conversation, you never would have guessed. However, within hours, or actually within minutes, Brian Stelter from the New York Times saw that tweet via a friend of his and actually retweeted it. And once the New York Times retweeted it, the whole thing exploded. The guy ended up with like another 20,000 followers overnight. Not that that was really the important outcome here, but what's important about the point is that there's this wildcard category that you can't necessarily build a propensity model for. However, once something happens, you can learn from that. So anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents on influence today. But why it's important is if you look at this particular case study, this is a holding company, restaurant holding company. They have a bunch of steakhouses. And any of you who are meat eaters or who are really big steak fans know that when you go to a steakhouse, you're spending a lot of money for a single piece of steak. And it's really important. The quality is everything. You know, the experience is wonderful, but the quality is everything. And so this company started to get some word of mouth that people were walking out of their restaurants, some of the restaurants, not having an experience that was up to par. And it was like word of mouth in the old-fashioned way, like actual, you know, how was your meal? You know, actually it wasn't as good as it was the last time. And so they started to wonder, you know, is something going on? And so they took a look at their tool, which actually looked at, also looks at some structured data like star ratings and things like that. And what they were able to see was that actually there was this groundswell of negative opinion about their restaurants that had come up very quickly. And not only had it come up very quickly, it seemed to be, based on profile scraping and various other things, it seemed to be confined to some very specific geographic locations. So they could see that they had a problem in like 5 or 6 different particular hubs where they had steakhouses, but not in all of them. Why? Because, there was a supplier who supplied those restaurants. The supplier had done a bait and switch on the meat quality. And so what they found was that they went in and actually checked the samples from that particular supplier that they were suspicious about. They found the meat samples didn't, you know, meet their quality standards, and they fired the supplier on the spot, somebody that they had done business with for quite a long time. It required a lot of training and a lot of kind of re-education of people, but what it really was able to do was to validate an assumption. That was an unknown, or maybe a known unknown, but it was a wild card because all of a sudden there was a groundswell of people who were influential about a particular issue that they hadn't been expecting. So I want to talk a little bit about social data intelligence, because what's important here is that I think we're moving from a time of listening and a time of engagement and sort of trying to figure out the levers to data and listening and engagement to a time where social data is actually such a strong signal. And you've heard this now from Zach and you've heard this from Seth, and I completely agree. It's such a strong signal that it needs its own kind of discipline around it. And so we're calling that social data intelligence. And the key levers here for social data intelligence is that you have to be confident, right? And we know we're not all confident about sentiment analysis completely. We know that human beings, even with the best possible beautiful algorithm ever, that human beings will still, your guy in HR and your guy in legal are still going to argue about whether that tweet was positive or negative. You've all been there. No, it was really not that bad. No, it was horrible. We're going to get sued. No, it really wasn't that bad. We should act. We shouldn't act. They're never going to agree. But you have to have a level of confidence. And the confidence doesn't mean you have to agree, but you do have to agree on at least how you're going to interpret it, so that you can agree to disagree later. And I actually heard a fantastic talk at an event called Brandworks University that's put on by Lindsay Stone and Briggs, and it's in Madison every year. And they had Filippo Passerini, who has a really long title, but he's like the CIO, CTO, and head of research and insights at Procter & Gamble. And his, you know, the thing that I remember overall from his talk was that, you know, he oversees, if you think about Procter & Gamble, I mean, I don't know there's any company who has more brands. I mean, maybe there's one of you know who has the most brands, but they have tons and tons of brands. But what he said was, you have to have a single version of the truth. You have to have a single version of the truth. And when you think about the number of tools that you have in-house, some have 1% of the fire hose, some are keyword-based, some have the full fire hose, some are just pulling, you know, data, you know, some are non-listening, other things, market research, et cetera, that are pulling from different customer sets or different panels. You have to have a way that you're going to kind of rationalize all that stuff. So confidently. The next thing is at scale, because this stuff is brute force now, and I'm going to show you some case studies, but these case studies I'm telling you were done with blood, sweat, and tears. And if your agencies are doing them for you, they're probably hiding their pain, agency people. Am I correct? Yes, you're hiding your pain. But also in conjunction with other data sources, right? Because there's only so much you can learn from your existing customer base, as Seth saw with market research. We also see this with CRM, and I'll give you some examples. So you want to use all that. You want to make strategic decisions. So what I'm proposing here is let's have a discipline around it. So yes, it's hard. Social data is hard. And we all make our business to some degree based on the fact that social data is hard. And when social data gets really easy, we're going to have to figure out something else to do. But in the meantime, the three things to think about are, number one, you've got multiple constituencies. You have those 13 different departments all working harmoniously together. Not so much, because a lot of this is new, and you're working out new governance, and you're working out new policies, and you're working out new data sharing, and some of them use your collaboration platform, and some of them are still getting used to email, and it's just the way big companies work, right? The second thing is, big data requires new analytical approaches. And this is the first time I've said big data, but one of the big kind of revelations here, and it's not a revelation to the technologists in the room, but it is a revelation for a lot of the rest of us who came up through marketing and corp comm, is that social data is big data. And if you're doing social data, you're doing big data. So the definition of big data, which was established actually by Doug Laney of Gartner Group back in 2001, just chew on that for a second, is it has three characteristics. There's a much richer description and everything else behind all of this, but just for our purposes, three things. 3 V's: variety, so lots of different types, video, audio files like a SoundCloud file, images, slideshows, likes, social actions, likes +1, shares, retweets, and then actual, posts themselves. All those different varieties. Then volume, of course, high volume, incredibly high volume. If we're talking about Twitter, it's 500 million tweets per day, as we saw from the S1. And then the third is velocity. It moves really fast. And so there's a Japanese soap opera called Castle in the Sky. I think they had like 38,000 tweets per minute. I think they just broke the record for I don't know how anybody could possibly tweet that much about a soap opera that quickly. But if you want to compare that to the death of Osama bin Laden, that was 4,000 to 5,000 tweets per minute. And then Beyonce, Baby Bump, VMAs 2 years ago is about 8,000. So there's a relative view of the way our culture looks at different events. So social data is big data, and it requires new analytical approaches because it breaks silos in the organization, and all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of people who care about that data. It's not just marketing and social strategists anymore. And then the third piece is that, so it's because it's new, it sometimes lacks credibility. And any of you who work with this data, either on the brand or the enterprise side, know that you probably have to work pretty hard to make your case, because people are asking you a lot of questions about, well, how do you know this, and what's the ROI, and what's our biggest competitor doing, and on and on and on and on, because they're not used to making decisions based on this data set, because this data set is new. They are used to making decisions, for example, based on their supply chain systems, based on their CRM systems, based on web analytics even, because they've had 15 or 20 years in many cases to figure it out. And we're still in the very early days. And if you remember nothing else, just remember that, because this is actually a hard new thing. And the biggest thing about it is that it's this enormous big data set, and it's entirely outside your organization's control. And that, I think, is the hardest thing for executives to swallow a lot of times. The next thing is that there are characteristics of social data to consider. So one of the things I really want to start to evangelize about, until the point that I'm annoying, so just let me know, is that it's not all the same, right? So different platforms operate differently. Facebook and Twitter are news feeds. They go by really fast. There's 160 characters in a tweet versus pretty much whatever you can fit into a Facebook post. A Pinterest pin, on the other hand, is an image, and it lasts forever, or until you take it down. So if you're thinking about, one of the questions I think that came up earlier was about sort of the relative lifespan of influence, right? Or influencers, but I'm actually thinking about the relative lifespan of influence. If you're a fashion brand, Pinterest or Tumblr is going to have a much longer shelf life for you than a tweet. A tweet might create an action and point somebody to something in the moment, but if you're actually looking for a longer term kind of impact, it's going to be a Pinterest or a Tumblr or a blog or something like that. The downside of that is once they start to get much more sophisticated in terms of commerce capability, if I go to Pinterest and I see the shoes, the shoe manna from heaven, and I pin it and I want to click through and I want to buy it, and oops, it was last spring and they're all out of it, I'm going to be disappointed. So content type, social action type, a +1 versus a retweet versus a share, they're all different. They go to different places, they create different outcomes. So for example, if I like a brand on Facebook, I have basically just said, you now have permission to market to me. If I share, I've now pushed it all out into my friend's newsfeed. So in the like situation, the onus is on me, because all the stuff is now coming to me. In the share situation, I've now put my reputation on the line, in some sense, with all of my friends. The content lifespan we talked about. The platform demographic, actually Seth and I were talking about this a little bit at the break, that social media is representative now, yes, for sure, and I completely agree. But it doesn't mean that it's not bias-free. And if you look at, in fact, Pew did a study around the presidential election, and in the presidential election, they wanted to understand, is there a bias on social media, Republican versus Democrat? And they actually did see two very interesting findings. One is that there are more Democrats on Twitter than Republicans, at least as disclosed. And number two, if you were extreme on either side, you were much more likely to be active. So that was kind of interesting. So when you think about it, there was a lot of feedback. Whatever your politics, there was a lot of commentary that the Mitt Romney campaign didn't use social media very well, and the Obama campaign really used social media very well. Whatever your belief on that, one thing I would say as a kind of a caveat to that is that Mitt Romney's people were not on social media to the extent that Barack Obama's people were. So if I'm his campaign manager, I might be saying, yeah, we should be doing more advertising spending and investing less in social. Would it have worked out? I don't know. Type of user relationship. If you think about, for example, the comments on Facebook versus the comments on Path, for any of you who might use Path, versus the type of comments on Reddit or YouTube, you start to get a sense of what I mean. So there's a little bit about close-knit relationships, people who have trust, versus people who are coming because they are not necessarily so much in a social graph together, but they're in an interest graph, meaning that they're coming because they like kiteboarding or they like talking about Kim Kardashian or whatever it might be, or they want to listen to Benedict Cumberbatch talk about the Julian Assange movie. And so sometimes you will see, for example, you have to know that if you're looking at YouTube comments on a video, and it really doesn't matter what the video is, but if you're looking at YouTube comments on a video, you're going to see a lot more negativity on certain kinds of videos than you would see on similar posts in other platforms. Because, frankly, people don't have to behave very well. And probably some sociologist is doing work on this, I don't know. Then there's data type, we talked about that. We talked about video versus audio versus narrative versus star rating versus unstructured versus structured data. And then finally there's the location piece, which is that if you're following people on Foursquare, you know where they are because they've checked in. If you're looking at people on Twitter, I don't know what the percentage is these days, maybe somebody in the audience knows, but not everybody is disclosing their location, and so in many cases you can get pretty good because somebody will self-disclose they live in Boulder or they live in San Francisco, but you don't actually know where they physically are. And of course, Twitter is only looking at the IP address that you used when you registered. So let's talk about actionableness, actionability. This is a model that I created a couple of years ago, and it was really intended to start to answer that question, what is the business value of social data? It's called the Social Media Measurement Compass because the founding premise of it is that the value of social media depends on your goal. So did you get there? Depends on where you're going. Did you win the game? Depends on what game you're playing. And I just wanted to kind of lay this out, and so I interviewed a whole ton of companies and found 6 use cases. And this is, by the way, all published, and I can tweet out the links and stuff. But so the first is brand health. We talked about that a whole lot today. Do people like us? Do they hate us? Why do they like us? Why do they hate us? Do they like us more than our competitors, less than our competitors, more this week than last week, et cetera? The next thing is marketing optimization. Are our campaigns performing? Is our media mix appropriate? Those are very hard questions to answer. The first one more than the second is easier. But you want to understand, like, is our kind of social investment paying off in terms of marketing? The third is revenue generation. Not the best use case for social, because people don't necessarily always come to social to buy things. They come to social to share their lunch, what they had, what they're talking about, what they're reading, what they're interested in, where they're going, all the different things that they do in the course of a day. And they could be in any point of a sales cycle. You have no idea where they are. And you can start to, using some of the work that Zach has done and that Seth is doing and various other people in the industry are doing, start to kind of create that sense of which actions and which types of kind of interactions and behavioral characteristics map to things like awareness, map to things like consideration. Oh, I wish, I'm thinking about buying a new hybrid car. Should I get a Leaf or a Prius? And then, of course, conversion, where you can actually see, using tags and a web analytics tool, some kind of relationship between a social post and a conversion behavior, assuming that you're on the same browser or assuming that you have good enough web analytics that you can actually attribute. Then there's operational efficiency. It's probably not the best name for it anymore, but here I'm thinking about ways that social can help you save money. Shockingly, you can, because if you're thinking about something very simple like a call deflection metric, one of the things that happens a lot is that things happen a lot, right? Things happen a lot, and then people want to call a phone number and find out what's going on. So my ESPN2 just went out. I'm in Michigan. Anybody else having this problem? DirecTV actually does this. They'll look at Twitter, and they'll actually look for clusters like this, and they'll check back in the call center, and they'll see, are they getting similar reports? If the call center says we don't have an identified issue, then they'll look into it and they'll put a holder note up on Twitter and say, we've heard some isolated reports of issues in this area. Hang tight, we're looking into it. By doing that, they have just prevented some number of people from calling the 800 number. Those calls are usually a cost of between $6 and $10 per call. And if you're like me and your washing machine breaks repeatedly, they are $6 to $10 per call per day. And that's a very big cost, right? It's a very big cost, as opposed to the 10 cents it takes for somebody to put that tweet up and then reach potentially thousands, if not millions of people. Then we go into, so that's just one example. Risk and fraud detection is another, and I'll talk about that later. Then there's customer experience. Are we, and we've seen, in fact, there's a new report out today by MIT Sloan School. I think it's sponsored by Capgemini, and they talk about the impact of social media on the customer experience. And in some cases, you can say, oh, it's kind of a PR thing, Comcast cares and all of that, or ask Wells Fargo. But the reality is that it does kind of give people another place to go. And so can you actually measure the impact of social media on the customer experience? Are people happier, more loyal, more willing to engage with you? And then finally, there's innovation. And I have a good example there too from Symantec of them taking in ideas, what they call RFEs, which stands for Requests for Enhancement, and actually funneling them to their product team to evaluate and then potentially implement. So I'm just going to breeze through this. This is just a model quickly to define, like, what are your metrics? What's the goal? How will you measure it? These are just some very simple examples. But you can start to kind of create for yourself a sense of structure. And I think, more important than this really is the idea that the more able you are to take ownership over the strategy and the approach that you're going to use to collect and interpret and act on social data, the less stress you're going to get from your colleagues and stakeholders in other places, because they're going to see you have it under control and that you've thought about it and that you understand kind of the nuances of the data that you're working with. And I actually think that this is a case in which the confidence, you need to bring confidence to the table even if you don't have total confidence, because you kind of know what problems you're starting to solve for, and you know that they're challenging problems, and you can start to set some expectations up front. The next thing is prioritization. I actually have a worksheet on my blog, and I think it's on the Altimeter blog too, that you can download. It's an Excel spreadsheet. And basically, what it means is if there are 10 of you, get in a room together and take a look and try to figure out, how important is this metric to me? So for example, if you're talking about the relationship of social to conversion, that is a 5. That is like one of the most important things we can understand because we can put a dollar value on social media. How capable are we to do that today? We are so not capable. I give that a 1. Why? Because our tools don't connect to each other. We don't have the right people. I don't even know how to figure that out. Just like forget it until next year. Then there's the resource. Well, I could have somebody sit down and spend 18 hours on a pivot table, but I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do. And then the next thing is the dependency. Are there other metrics that depend on that down the road? If you look at something like brand sentiment, it is valuable. It gives you good directional insight, right? You probably, if you have a tool like Sysomos, yes, you're capable, yes, you have the resources, and then other things are highly dependent on it because then you can start to see conversation drivers and various other things. So that's why that kind of pops up as a higher number. This is the process I just talked about. Symantec is a great example. I love this case study because it's not the sexiest one in the world, but it's the one that I think adds a level of organizational reassurance and organizational kind of confidence to social data. And here, what they've basically done is gotten these 6 groups together, marketing, customer support, engineering, PR, product management, and legal. They are all represented in a hub, in a sort of center of excellence within the organization. And they have determined that there are 7 different categories of what they call AIMS, and that stands for Actionable Internet Mentions. Anything that happens on the internet we need to do something about is an AIM. There are 7 different types of AIMS. The first is a case, help me fix this problem. The second case is a query. I have a question, can you answer it? But it doesn't require call center. First one does require call center. Goes into CRM, by the way, manually. That's back to the brute force problem of scale. Somebody's going to manually enter that tweet into a CRM system, at least until this all gets fixed in the perfect future. Then there's a rant. I hate you, and here's why. But it does merit some response. Why do you hate us? Can we help you? Is there some way in which we can make you happier? Then there's a rave. I love you, and here's why. Thank you, gracious response. Maybe there's something else we can do for you in the future. Everybody's happy. Then there's a lead. I'm thinking about buying some kind of security solution. Can we help you? Can we provide you some information? That goes into sales pipeline. RFE stands for Request for Enhancement. I wish your system did this. That's the one I mentioned that goes to the product team. And then finally, the ringer. And this is the ringer because it was the biggest surprise to them. And this was, hey, there's a whole bunch of fraud out there, a whole bunch of fraudulent downloads of our programs. And now, because we're using listening, we're able to find them. Now, when you think about it, Symantec is a security company. Even when you don't think about it, they're a security company. And when you think about the legal department of a security company, this is not the team that you would think is the most likely to be advocates for social media. But these guys are passionate advocates because all of a sudden, they have this fantastic way of discovering fraud instances that they never saw before. And so they've become a really big advocate. Results, they won't give us, actual numbers, so sorry, but, customer experience, lead generation, risk mitigation, product improvement, all these things give them enough happiness and support and reassurance that they are continuing to invest. So in terms of building a data-driven organization, this is a very busy chart, but I want to just give you the essential here, that what we're seeing now is a maturity, sort of an evolution into maturity of organizations. To be honest, we just finished some research in which we have some numbers to put behind this. I don't have those numbers yet. They're still raw and being cut. But most everybody's here, obviously. The first stage is ad hoc. It's like we're just learning. It's really the learning stage. We're just learning. We're figuring it out. We're maybe mostly measuring volume metrics. We don't really have much sense of the impact on the business, but we know we're getting more engagements, more shares, more fans, more followers, et cetera. And we're figuring out the processes as we go, and it's really kind of limited to one group or maybe two groups. We don't really know what our benchmarks are. That's ad hoc. The next phase is formalized. That's where Symantec is, sort of, between 2 and 3. Formalized is, so we've now formalized our processes. We know what our approaches are. We know what our core metrics are. We know what our benchmarks, we're figuring them out. We have some, basic governance in place, so at least we feel like we're not missing anything major. But the most important piece to that phase is we're starting to map social media to actual business objectives. And if you think about Symantec, with that list of 7, they are really clear that they can see a business outcome for their social media investment. But here's the problem with formalized. It's just social data. It has no impact yet on any other data stream in the organization. And so when you think about what's going on with, I have to take this off because it's starting to throttle me. When you think about the relationship, for example, between social data and other enterprise data like a CRM, what's really important to know is that you have these blind spots, right? You have things that you know about in CRM that your support team knows about. And if your support team and your social team are different, your social team may not know that there's an identified issue that's happening in service until it starts popping up, but they don't have context. And this can also happen vice versa. It's popping up in social, but CRM doesn't have context. There's also an example from another vendor, and I won't name names today, but this is a company that wanted to, it was a yogurt company, and they wanted to understand what was their most popular flavor. And they looked at BI to see, what was selling the best, and the answer was, duh, vanilla. And then they looked at social data, and the answer was pineapple. And they're like, what do you mean pineapple? We don't even make very much pineapple. It's kind of a test flavor, like it's in limited release and everything. But then when they looked at the social data, they could see that people were tweeting like, I went to Whole Foods or I went to Safeway to get the pineapple yogurt. They're out of it. Does anybody know if they have it in the one in Potrero Hill, or whatever it might be? And they were like running around. People were running around the city like trying to find the pineapple yogurt. It was so popular. People actually talking about it. Maybe not in conjunction with their colonoscopies, but they were talking about it to the extent that they could see popularity and sales were different. Popularity, a leading indicator, right? So that was really interesting. So integrated is all of these things when you start to actually see the relationship between the social data and other data sets. Now with market research, who knows, maybe it will replace market research at some point. If you think about something as simple as a net promoter score though, where you're just saying, will you or won't you recommend, trying to pull that out of social is going to be tough. And then finally, the last stage, holistic, which also I like to think of as the rainbows and unicorns maturity stage. This is when you can do this, but you can do it at scale. Nobody can do this now, so don't worry about it. Caesars, just the point here, I know I'm really low on time, but Caesars, the point of this case study is it's very aspirational. And what they're trying to do here is very much along the lines of what Zach was talking about earlier, which is trying to kind of integrate all these touch points together and try to look at social in the context of other advertising channels, email, organic, search, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when you think about it, people go to Caesars for vastly different reasons. Some people go to gamble to the casino. Some people go to the hotels to stay while they're in Vegas, gamble or not. Some people just go to the restaurants, and some people like to golf all day. Some people do all of those things. But I guarantee you that in a few years, whether it's Caesars or somebody else, the idea will be that we'll all have different experiences on the web when we go because they'll know what we like. They won't keep sending me golf stuff because I've never been on a golf course in my life. But they will offer me maybe something else that's more to my taste. And so this is kind of the direction that everybody should have a different experience, even to check in and check out. So that when I check in, they say, oh, Ms. Etlenger, we noticed that you were here last time and you really enjoyed the restaurant. We have a promotion and you can have, free appetizer if you go, during your stay today. And when I check out, I say, I really enjoyed the show. And they say, oh, that's great next time. Maybe then I get an email a few days from then. So that's the idea. They really want to understand all those touch points on and offline, across brands and across channels. So some final thoughts, and this will be the end of our session. The first thing I want to say is I kind of want to challenge you to flip your point of view. Many of you you're either in agency or you're in marketing or social. Is there anybody who's not, by the way, in the room, who's not in either agency, marketing, or social? No. Ha. Okay. Sometimes this happens. So the idea here is we think about social media from an organization-centric point of view. How can we look at customer service? How can we look at the customer experience? How can we look at marketing? How can we look at sales? Blah, 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 blah. What if you look at it from the customer's point of view, from the customer journey point of view? So this is, again, very much in line with what Zach was talking about earlier. So the idea is if you flip your point of view, in a perfect world, if you could design your system around that customer journey as opposed to around the realities of your organization, that would be a wonderful world. The next thing is big data is here. You are already doing it. You can go back and tell your boss you're doing it. And the things that you're doing with social data today are going to pave the way. And I'm talking about the stakeholder management, the process and governance development, the analytical approaches. All of those things are already infrastructure that you're building to deal with other data sets down the road. And you will be dealing with other data sets down the road, I guarantee. Next thing is mind the hippo. Does anybody know what the hippo phenomenon is? What hippo stands for? Okay, so Harvard Business Review did a really fantastic issue about big data in, I think, September, I want to say, of 2012. And they talked about one of the biggest issues of but big data in general is the cultural impact, because big data, social data as we know, gives you radical transparency. So if you're the CEO of Barilla and you say some not particularly insightful comments about what kinds of people you like in your advertising, in the past that would be in a news story. It would have probably stayed in Italy. Nobody really would have paid a whole lot of attention to it, but there would have been an outcry among people who saw it, but it wouldn't have moved around the world as quickly as it did. But it did. And today, the challenge with social data is that it creates this radical transparency so that your teams, meaning you guys, you know more about your business and the things that people love and hate about your business than your bosses do and your CEOs do. And you have more data. HIPPO stands for the way that decisions have traditionally been made in organizations. It stands for highest paid person's opinion. And that's how people typically, they point to the boss, where's Kurt, right? And say, Kurt, what do you think? And then Kurt says, I think A. And everybody goes, A is a great idea. What if you guys all have this data that tells you A is not such a good idea? Kurt has tons of, sorry to pick on you, has tons of experience, creative mind, all these different things. But actually our data is telling us something that we may not have sensed otherwise. What do? That's the HIPPO phenomenon. So the challenge is going to be how are organizations going to deal in a world where there is this balance of data and sort of, let's just call it the creative, right? Because a lot of, especially those of you who have worked in marketing for a long time will know that there's a certain kind of magic and a certain kind of momentum behind this idea of the creative idea. And the creative idea is a beautiful thing, but it can't be divorced from data. And data is a beautiful thing, but it can't be divorced from the creative too. And then finally, just to leave you with a terrifying thought, everything that I'm talking about now is continuing to go faster and faster. And this is because all of this is, the great news is this is all going to come to you in real time. The bad news is this is all going to come to you in real time. And if you don't have the processes in place to deal with it, you're going to be having the same issues that you have, just more of them during the day and faster and more frequently. And so that's kind of the reason to think about this from a maturity standpoint and a discipline standpoint. I know it's not the most exciting message in the world, but I hope it's inspiring in a way because I think it's an opportunity for those of us who are doing this work right now to take control and to, not control, but to take sort of a leadership role and to say, look, we know this is going to be hard. We can see the steps. We're going to draw a picture for you. So with that, thank you.